Hey sis! From coast to coast, we're bridging the gap between the cisgender and transgender community, creating meaningful dialogue and space to learn and grow.
Join us as we connect with our community, break down tough conversations, and get comfortable being better humans.
Welcome to Hey Sis! My name is Isaac Cook, and today I'm joined by the ever so amazing Emma Stanley. Sin and I had the pleasure of being joined by Emma back in December to end the 2022 year, and she also spoke about her journey as a world traveler in Season 3, Episode 29 and 30.
Hi, I'm Emma Stanley. I'm an inclusion consultant and the director of program development with Simply Good Form. We're a Halifax-based inclusion company. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been in the education industry and then more recently in inclusion training for about 10 years.
Welcome back to the show, Emma.
Thanks for having me in again, Isaac.
Always a pleasure. So, International Transgender Day of Visibility, or TDoV, is an annual event occurring on March 31st dedicated to celebrating transgender people and raising awareness of discrimination faced by transgender people worldwide. It is a day that is very near and dear to both of our hearts, as you know, as we are trans people. But I wanted to toss the question your way first and foremost. So, for you, what is the biggest payoff of TDOV and events and celebrations similar to TDOV and trans visibility as a whole?
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a big question, but I think it does boil down to a couple of points. When trans people who are already out and living their authentic lives are able to see others like themselves and connect with that community, the support is unbelievable. The change in your life when you move from being someone who is alone or isolated to being someone who is a part of a community, even if that community is dispersed worldwide, is profound. It changes the way that you view yourself, your future, your ability to thrive wherever it is you are. And that affects your ambitions as well, your life plans. Certainly, in my case, finding my community was not just a sort of social or support aspect, but it allowed me the confidence to make my ambitions bigger, and so it ended up changing my career path. It ended up changing where I lived. And all of that basically stemmed from feeling like I had a support network.
Yeah.
And that's the case for other trans people as well. When you talk about it in terms of people that aren't out yet, that haven't been able to find that safe space to live authentically, it shows people living their lives as their authentic selves and doing it successfully and without an enormous amount of drama.
Yeah.
The visibility of people living without drama.
A lot of times when, in particular, non-trans or non-queer people talk about the trans experiences, it's probably 90% of the time over dramatized and
Mhm.
focusing on the struggles of being trans. What are the experience like to transition, the hardships, the relationship struggles, things like that. And we don't often get to celebrate a trans CEO or like a trans woman excelling in her career, or just the mundane things of like being able to go to a grocery store and not get misgendered, like little things like that give people hope and give people comfort. And it's easy, especially in the day and age that we currently live in, where everything is on social media or put on the news. It's easy to only focus on the stuff that's going to get people either angry or sad. Like those two emotions are what kind of fuels that fire. But for myself, I love seeing those kind of like more mundane, and I agree with you,
Mhm.
like, kind of like not the normal people experiences, but like the average Joe going out in the world and being
Yeah.
like, I'm just doing me.
And it's interesting you mentioned angry and sad. I think I would add, victorious to that. There
Yes.
are just as many sort of clickbait emotions that feel good, but again, they get focused on so heavily, we ignore the happily ever after part of it, where it's just you're just living your life. You just wanna go to IKEA or whatever. So, when trans people who are in the mundane part of their lives, where it's not necessarily the focus of their existence anymore, come out and say, "Hey, I'm out. I'm living my life. I don't really have an amazing story for you, but I do exist." It
Mhm.
gives that visibility and that representation that we're usually missing in entertainment media.
Yeah. Well, and it also brings up that idea of, like, what comes next, right? Like, say you're a person and your goal is to, medically transition and also socially transition. So you socially transition, you get your support people, you're comforted, you go through the systems in place and the barriers, and then you medically transition, you go through those steps, and then it's like, what next? Right? Like you're
Mhm.
going into those stages of your life. And I know both kind of me and you are kind of in those stages now in our lives where we're not necessarily needing to put so much fuel into being like, "Okay, I need to get, like, my name changed," or, like, those, like, key parts
Yeah.
of the transition. Like, afterwards, we're like, "Okay, like, now we're in our careers, like, now we're just trying to buy a house or move or, like, find roommates or, buy groceries," like, things like that, and it's interesting. Like, it's an interesting, unique experience that I think all trans people go through, and there's so much intersectionalities as well intertwined
Mhm.
with that makes that what's next so unique.
Yeah, I think the focus is so laser targeted on the coming out and the initial experience and the interesting part, basically,
Yeah.
the dramatic part that we lose that. So it's good. I mean, look at the holidays that we do have. We have, other than the Day of Visibility, we have National Coming Out Day or
Mhm.
International Coming Out Day, and the Trans Day of Remembrance. So it's like coming out and when we die. Those are the interesting bits that the rest of the world is actually interested in. The rest of it is just like going shopping and no one cares.
Yeah.
For people who are still struggling with it, still questioning, still trying to find their moment to be themselves, I think that showing that you can just live your life in a way that is not dramatic, it's not an inspirational story, is incredibly important.
Yeah, and I think on that too, like, there's always a tricky idea that everyone wants to be an advocate and everyone wants to be their own advocate, but some people, like, aren't good at advocating for themselves, and people
Mm.
automatically assume, like, if you are a trans person, then you should be, like, the key go-to for, like, everything and anything related to this idea, but there's also the fact that, like, when you're trans, like, you don't just come out once. You don't just come out twice. You
No.
come out in multiple different stages of your life, and a lot of times people transition more than once. Like, it doesn't just happen that, you identify as this and then, 20 years down the road, you're going to still be identifying as that same thing. Like, your identity fluctuates and changes. Like, I think the best way for me maybe to explain it to people who maybe aren't as intertwined with the trans community is
Yeah.
that, for instance, for myself, when I first came out as a blue baby, I was, I think 14, 12 maybe, and I was like, "Okay, I have this, like, preconceived notion of, like, who I wanna be when I'm, like, older," and that was comprised of being, like, basically as close to a cis man as I possibly could as a
Mhm.
someone assigned female at birth, because when you're younger and you're taught about, or maybe not taught about trans identities, you automatically think, "Okay, if I'm X, I have to be the complete opposite of that."
Yeah, very much.
And then when you get older, you're like, "Okay, no, I don't actually have to subscribe to very cis heteronormative ideologies about gender identity, sexuality, things like that." So, like, when I turned 16, I started hormone therapy, and then I was like, "Oh, I really don't wanna be a cis man." Like, I identify more with being, like, non-binary or, like, gender
Mm.
fluid, and, like, your identities change between that. So that's another really important aspect of visibility for people to consider, is that feelings of yourself change over time, and the way
Yeah.
that you are going to make yourself visible to others or even visible to yourself is going to change over time. So it's never going to be like a one and done event.
I always get a bit sad when people talk about phases because there's the classic line, "Oh, it's just a phase," and then the
Yeah.
classic retort, "It's not just a phase." And I mean, it's a tricky conversation because the word phase is kind of silly. Everything is a phase. I was born
Mhm.
a baby,
That's a
which
phase.
sounds really funny to say, but like I am no longer that thing. Everybody, everybody has many identities over the course of their lives.
Mhm.
Adding the aspect of gender to that mix, whether it's you're a parent of a young child, a parent of a teenager, a parent of adult children. Those are three different phases of a life, but they're deep and they're meaningful. And as we grow and change, we go through different identities. And yeah, so adding gender to that mix is just one extra aspect of a process that everyone already does.
Mhm.
It's not a unique process. It's just an added component.
Yeah, and the concept of phases, at least to me, almost seems like there's, like, an expiration to something or,
Yeah.
like and I think people become too muddled up in that idea that, like it's exactly as you said, like, the stereotypical, like, "It's not a phase, mom," kinda thing,
Yeah.
we're not technically, yes, they are phases, but it's more of, like, an evolution. Like, for instance, like, if you're in I'll use, like, the job or, like, career example, is that, like, if you're in
Mhm.
one role and then you get a, promotion, you're in a different role, technically, that's a phase of your life that's now changed, but you're still growing on those, like, steps that you then built up to that
Mhm.
position. And it's similar with, like, gender identity, sexuality, your at all the different identities that you might identify with, religion, things like that, is that you learn things and then you also unlearn things about yourself and the
Mhm.
world and other people around you. So then you use those all the mix of those experiences as you evolve into hopefully being a better person, for yourself and the people around you, to create yourself and to make yourself.
Yeah.
Hey Sis is all about connecting communities, and thanks to support from TD Bank Group, here is this episode's Connected Community Moment.
So we are thrilled to announce that for those located in Nova Scotia, in partnership with the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia, Mount St. Vincent University, the Halifax Public Libraries, Dalhousie Legal Aid, and Gender Affirming Care Nova Scotia, we are offering a name change and gender marker clinic on March 31st, which is the day of TDoV, from 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. at Mount St. Vincent University. There will be two fabulous volunteer lawyers on site with thanks to Dalhousie Legal Aid to witness and sign pre-prepared documents.
If you check out the website, you'll find a link that will allow you to make an appointment. We are able to process walk-ins, but it will be a lot smoother if you can make an appointment before you come in on that was March 31st. We will have volunteers there to take you through the paperwork as well. If you are just wanting to gather information, that is absolutely allowed and recommended.
You can learn more at simplygoodform.com/name_gender_marker_change_pathway or by checking the link in the show notes. We look forward to seeing you there. This has been a Hey Sis and TD Bank Group Connected Communities moment because inclusion matters. So, what's the value of having a gender marker and name change clinic, especially for our community?
I don't know how many of the listeners have interacted with Canadian bureaucratic systems, but they are labyrinthine. The name and gender marker change process has come a long way, but it is still a lot of steps, a lot of forms, and a lot of very anxiety inducing spaces. One of the first steps is having to go to a police station to get fingerprinted. And that alone makes a lot of people so anxious they will not want to continue with the process. So there are significant boundaries for the community in accessing this and accessing the ability to live your identity legally is a profound part of a human's experience.
Mhm.
Your name, your legal name affects almost every area of your life. It determines in part your access to Medicare. It determines how you're addressed by official sources. And not being able to live under your own name is a deeply frustrating experience. I had to do that for many years before I was able to legally change my name. And it was incredibly frustrating. Because every time you walk into a hospital, which if you're transitioning medically, you do a lot,
Yeah.
they have to check your legal name. And every time you walk into a bank, and every time you have to interact with police, and that one gets even more terrifying than the others, are certainly much more anxiety inducing because the last thing that anybody really wants to do is stand out to police.
Yeah.
So it's a thing that people who have, or I want to say, people who own their own name rarely see, and that is perfectly understandable. But when your legal name is not your real name, you quickly become aware of how often you are required to use your legal name and how demeaning it is to have to sort of wear your story on your sleeve.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. And legal access to your own identity is something that a lot of people need. And
Hmm.
because of the process for getting it, it is again confusing and a bit scary. So we're trying to give people a softer path towards just simply getting access to a service that is already available and a lot of people need.
There's a lot of barriers that people don't recognize in terms of like finances of changing your name,
Yeah.
and also and kind of jumping back again to like geography. You have to go to vital statistics in Nova Scotia in particular. There's only like one office, and that is in
Mhm.
Bayers Lake in Halifax, which, is not the easiest to navigate, even if you're in Halifax trying to get there by bus. I did that when I was changing my name and it was awful. It's tricky in those sides. And then also on the finance side, these are legal documents. Therefore, they need to be legally verified by someone. Therefore, you have to find someone to notarize things or to sign off on them.
Mhm.
Finding the people to be able to support you in this journey, because it is a journey, is one step of this. And people like don't realize too, like how many IDs do you have with your name on it? Or if you're,
Mhm.
an older individual and you have an apartment, you have to change all your names on those documents, your credit card, your debit card, your license, your
Going back
passport.
and
Like,
getting every certification you've ever gotten, so your degree, your diploma,
yeah,
every license that you have under your name, the permanent ones that you haven't thought about in 20 years. You have to go back and get all of those changed because you use those certifications whenever you're applying for a job, and then that comes up. And we are still living in a world where when your documents don't match your introduction name, so if I introduce myself as Emma, but all of my old documents are in my old name, that comes up in the interview. And it's really frustrating because you can't just extend an interview most of the time, right? You have your 20-25 minutes.
mhm,
And if I spend 15 of those minutes explaining why my documents are in a different name, I only have 10 minutes to sell myself to a prospective employer. And that is a huge barrier. That is a
yeah,
problem. The one last point on the gender marker clinic is that if people just want to come in who have already gone through the process and make absolutely sure that they got every single step. I have a tiny personal anecdote here. I changed my name 2.5 years ago now, and I only very recently found out while we were building this clinic that I completely missed an important step, and my SIN number is still in my old name. So I have more paperwork to do. So, in terms of just giving people some peace of mind, if they do want to come in and just check to make sure that they have, in fact, completed every step, we can help with that.
if folks are not Canadian or are from another country, Cindy has a lot of experience with, the process for individuals who were born in Ireland, and we're always keen to learn more, about where are the barriers that exist in other countries. How can we help support that? Obviously, don't be expecting to be signing paperwork that day, but we can at least help you understand that process a little bit better. So I wanted to really jump back a little bit because we spoke really quickly kind of about like safety and security with identity. And there's one quote that I've carried with me ever since I first heard it, and hopefully I am citing this properly. We'll include it in the show notes, but I have a link to the tweet where it was posted. But it goes, to be visibly queer is to choose your happiness over your safety. And that's from at Deshawn LH on Twitter. And when I heard that, I was like, shit, that's
Yeah.
pretty true. And I mean, we hold a lot of privilege here in Canada, especially as we're both, white trans individuals, but there's still significant transphobia, in particular towards like trans women and trans misogyny throughout Canada and North America that is growing to degrees that I would have never imagined. To date, we'll also include some more of the links down in the show notes to folks who want to learn more. But Florida recently, down in the U.S., became the 8th state to restrict transgender care for minors, so individuals, I believe, under the age of 18, but in some states, I believe it's under the age of 25. So it's becoming increasingly more important to be visible, but in the same breath, it is becoming increasingly more dangerous to be visible.
Yeah.
Just curious kind of your takes on all this, Emma.
The world is becoming a scarier place, and or the world is becoming a scary place again is maybe the better phrasing of that. And while we have, as a community, this ability to see each other, this visibility, and this representation, it is really desperately important for us to form as many networks of support as we can and organize in the ways that we are able to think defensively, quite frankly.
Mhm.
Think about what happens if that comes here, because it's so easy to say that happens somewhere else. Because years ago, we said, oh, that only happens outside of North America. That only happens in this specific culture or that specific culture. And now it's knocking at our back door.
Mhm.
And that is a little bit terrifying. There is a part of me that is still saying, well, that's America. And that's simply not the case. The culture war that is happening right now has us dead center targeted, and that is terrifying.
Mhm.
And the best that we can do is continue to be visible, continue to organize, and continue to take action to secure our own space within our own culture.
Yeah.
It's frustrating because I know that those are very vague terms, like what is organizing to secure our space within our own culture, and the fact is I don't know. And I don't think any one person can know. You have to look around you, see what problems you can solve, what structures you can build, and act on that.
Mhm. To that exactly. I think it's really looking within our own communities and recognizing like where are the barriers that exist? Where do we need more visibility? Where does there need to be more trans informed decisions? And everyone can rip on Canada and Nova Scotia's healthcare, but I think that's one of the biggest like prime examples of areas that need trans informed care. And school systems, there's so many spots that need to be collaborating and working
Mhm.
closely with actual trans people, not, legislatures that say that they're representing the trans
Mhm.
populations, but actual trans people, and in particular, like BIPOC and Indigenous trans people who can also help support in those pieces of intersectionality that so often get missed. Trying to convince people, I think, is one of the most trickiest things right now in Canada. And I'll speak specifically to a Canadian lens, is because a lot of folks in positions of power fall under that same mentality. And I suffer from it too sometimes. It's very easy to be like, that's a US
Mhm.
problem. You know,
Yeah,
whenever
very
we
much.
talk about the news, like as I just said, like we're talking about Florida, we're talking about southern states, we're talking about areas that historically haven't been the safest for trans people. But people don't realize how quickly these ideologies trickle up into Canada and how, yes, while Canada and the United States and the UK and like France, we're all different countries and regions
Mhm.
and have their own government systems, but everything is very intertwined. And just because something is happening 5,000 miles away doesn't mean it can't happen in your own backyard. And I think we need to become more aware of who is at risk in our
Yeah.
backyard and who we can do better to protect when
Yeah.
they are visible.
It is an interesting thing with Canadian culture that we, I think, are more careful about what we project into the world
Mhm.
as opposed to Americans. And this is not a criticism of Americans, just a difference in culture. Canadians, I think, are better at optics, but not necessarily at all better in action. We get caught in the trap of seeing representation and assuming that means things are okay, and that is not the
Mhm.
case. I had a really interesting time. About a year ago, I went home to my hometown, and it is fairly rural. And while everyone was extremely good to me, because of course it's my hometown, they recognize me, so I don't need to tell people my story, they can see it. While I was in public, everyone was incredibly nice. And then after about a week, I started looking up old friends, and they said, "Yeah, absolutely, would love to hang out. You can't come by the house, though."
Hmm.
And it wasn't the people, it was their families, their partners.
Mhm.
People who had known me my whole life were great about it, and, that shows how far we've come, but they were not as sure about their families, and so we could hang out, but I couldn't visit, and this is in a town that is fairly rural, but the people there are great in public.
Mhm.
And I do think that it's easy to get caught in the trap of seeing all of the diversity and mistaking it for inclusion.
Yes. Oh, 100%. I think too, kind of as you said, like it's a very it's a worldwide issue, don't get me wrong, but Canada in particular has the issue with being like, here are the numbers, here's the data. We're good. Like there's trans
Yeah.
people here, there's indigenous people here, there's black people here. We're good, we don't have to do anything else. They exist. We can,
We're Canadians, we're
we're
so
good.
great.
Yeah, we're so
Are
nice.
you though?
Yeah, and I'm like, I yeah, Canada is very good at hiding things. We do a lot of covert, like transphobia, racism, things like that. And not a lot of it's overt, and you kind of have to, you know, peel away
Mhm.
and open the book to really see what's actually going on behind the scenes in a lot of these places. And a lot of times, it is those small towns. Like I also, not as small as you, but I did grow up in a smaller town. My high school was way too big, but it's interesting when you have a lot of that small town mentality, and then you kind of are perceived as like you're like the only trans person in the
Mm.
area, or you're like the go-to resource for your family, or you can tell the rural versus urban trans
Mm.
experience. Like they're very unique in their own kind of
Yeah,
subsets.
absolutely. And that's where you get into intersectionality, and the options and challenges that you face in a rural setting are so different from in a larger city, and a lot of that, bringing it right back to the beginning, is being able to find your community.
Mhm.
Small towns are isolating, and that
Yes.
is not fun.
Well, I remember there was someone recently did a surveys. Everyone loves surveys this time of the year. I don't know why. Maybe, end of
I fill out 3
fiscal or something.
surveys in the morning just for fun.
I know. Listen, I think I was sent like at least 3 or 4 today. Anyways, a little off topic, but there was a survey being done for like a rural community in Nova Scotia, and they were like, "What can we do better? What other resources can we provide these people?" And these people as in trans people and queer people as in myself. Um not to other myself, but here we
Phrasing,
are.
Isaac, phrasing.
Yeah, I know, I know, I know. Anywho, what we can do to help queer people in general in the
Yeah.
community. And one of the biggest things that I flagged, that I was like, there's literally nothing. If you ask anyone for like, where can I go for like queer support, they're like, go to Halifax. It's like, where
Yeah.
can I go to see a doctor that is at the very least informed of what HRT is for a trans body. They're like, go to the sexual health clinic in Halifax. I don't know. There are no resources in rural areas. So then
Mhm.
everything is sent to this one area, which then puts so much pressure on those resources in that one specific area because they're not
Yeah.
geographically spread around, nor are they supported if they try and start up. I know I'm getting on a little
Mhm.
bit of a side tangent, but everything kind of relates back to the idea of visibility. And if we don't have resources in these areas, how are you expecting people to be comfortably visible in these geographic
Yeah.
regions if they have to go, like in Nova Scotia, to Halifax to be properly visible and to be
Yeah.
properly comfortable? Why are we turning around and being like, why aren't there any trans people here? Meanwhile, like, go
They
to like
said as they put
Sydney.
them in a truck and shipped them to the city,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
isn't that weird?
Yeah, this is weird. But it's like, I just like, I look at like Sydney, Cape Breton, for instance, which is 4, 5 hours away from Halifax. I know people who used to have to drive like bi-weekly to monthly to get like testosterone shots or,
Yeah.
estrogen pills and stuff. And they could only get it prescribed in Halifax. We're slowly getting better at teleconferencing and stuff, but it's
Yeah.
still like, it's not there yet. So that's why
The
there's not
healthcare is an
people.
issue.
Yeah.
And we're starting. I don't think I mean, I would love to see the healthcare change and become more accessible. Of course, we're Canadians. Healthcare is pretty much an issue for everyone, and
Mhm.
rural healthcare in particular. We are trying to get more support programs out to rural areas. For example, Thrive. Shameless plug. I run a program called Thrive that is in partnership with the Mental Health Foundation of Nova Scotia. It is a program to try and introduce queer youth to the skills that they need to find a job. And one of the explicit focuses of Thrive was to get it out to the rural areas and not have it entirely be contained within HRM. And that's been more challenging than anyone on the team had expected at the beginning. And we're trying to remedy that now. But the momentum of everything already rolling towards the city is really hard to fight against.
Yeah, it's trying to find the right individuals or the right groups to be able to then disperse that. Like, just thinking of like a marketing and comms lens for myself, like being able to tap into those rural communities and find the individuals in those communities
Yeah.
who then feel comfortable opting in. If it's a younger individual living at home, maybe they're not out yet because there's not the resources in the
Yeah.
community to get the support. So then they then would have to partake in a program like this. I mean, obviously we don't require people to be out to everyone around them. They just have to simply self-identify. But in a lot of instances, if they're sitting in a meeting or talking to someone online and a parent or caregiver comes in and asks, what are you doing? And you have to explain that to them. It can get into some tricky conversations. So it's trying to find the right ways to deliver programs to these individuals and meet them where
Yes.
they're at. That's definitely like a universal struggle, I think, for anyone trying to deliver programs, and especially those that are not just in Nova Scotia but across Canada at large, is that it's always typically the city centers or those larger urban
Mhm.
locations that get the most uptake in terms of 2S LGBTQ programming, because there's just more people who will opt in those areas. But,
Yeah.
you know
And it's a vicious cycle. They get the funding, so they get the people, so they get the people, so they get the
Mhm.
funding.
Yeah, and they get the
Um,
numbers so that they can keep the
and it
funding and then
goes and it
keep
goes and
going.
it goes.
Yeah, and it's just this continuing cycle, and
Yeah.
it's trying to find ways to also represent these communities appropriately to funders to be like, "Hey, like, there's a huge, huge gap that we need to be recognizing and then putting funding into supporting." But kind of as we've been talking about for the past 30 minutes is that it's like an iceberg, right? Like, this is like
Mm.
the problem we're having. but
Yeah.
underneath, there's like, healthcare, school,
No, but we put
education,
pronoun
career.
pins on. You're fine
Oh, yeah, we're
now.
fine.
Haven't
We
you
put
seen the pronoun
we
pins?
do the
It's
rainbow
it's solved.
sidewalks.
We're good.
Yeah, we do the rainbow sidewalks in June, and then they wash away by August. We're fine.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because deep systemic problems are always solved by sidewalk chalk.
absolutely. So jumping back to Thrive, because I think this is kind of a perfect opportunity to be able to talk about programs like this. And also, shameless plug, because I think it's a really great program that, like, I think
I'm
more
glad you
people
do.
need to know about. Is so, kind of as we said, target demographics obviously are, 2S LGBTQ plus
Yeah.
individuals under the age of 25.
Yeah, 16 to 25 is the group we're focusing on, so sort of end of high school and beginning of your career.
Gotcha. And then what are the goals of like what folks partaking in the program learn out of it? Like, can you maybe give people like a quick run through of like
Yeah,
what
absolutely.
they can expect?
So Thrive is a free program. It's 5 weeks long. It's entirely online, and mostly asymmetrical. So that means that the lectures are pre-recorded and the assignments are graded when you finish them. It takes a couple hours a week to do, and what it does is give the participant the skills and confidence they need to get through their first interview. So we take it right from building a resume with new algorithmic hiring in mind. We have a surprising number of participants who mentioned that their parents are still telling them to like go in and ask to speak to the manager or bug
Oh.
them every day until you get a job, which is like I'm sure it
Maybe
was
in rural
like
towns.
yeah, it's the kind of advice that was absolutely relevant and it's being given in good faith, but it's unfortunately just not the case anymore. More and more hiring managers aren't actually allowed to see applicants until they get through an algorithmic
Mhm.
process. So we're building with the modern world in mind. And again, we take it right from resume building, researching your company, all the way up to a live interview, which will be with volunteer hiring managers from around the community. So when you leave the program, you have a certificate of completion, you have a work reference from Simply Good Form, and you have finished a live interview for a realistic but not real job. And it just gets those first day jitters out of the way so that when you go into your first real interview, you have one under your belt and you don't have to be as nervous about the process because you'll have done it before. And that's been really useful for our participants so far.
Yeah. And maybe just for folks who might not be aware, and I'm going to take this from kind of your perspective, is why the focus on 2S LGBTQ plus individuals? Like, what would you say are kind of the unique struggles that queer individuals face trying to find employment? Like, maybe just give a quick kind of overview of why.
Yeah, absolutely. You actually, I forgot two super important parts, and they answer this question. So that's perfect. When you are queer and you are in your late teens, the fact is it is more difficult to build networks. Networks are what get people into their careers and advance their careers more than any other part of your life, including your qualifications, including your training. It really very much still is not what you know, but who you know. And this isn't to say that it's all nepotism, it's opportunity. If you don't know that someone is hiring, then you can't apply for the job. And you find out who's hiring largely through your networks. So, a large part of our programming is teaching queer youth how to build networks that are available to them, as they are typically, especially for trans and non binary youth, locked out of a lot of the traditional means of building them. And that is a huge challenge for queer youth. And because of COVID, because we all love talking about the after effects of COVID, The more traditional means of building networks and experience, like volunteer opportunities, dried up for 2 years. And we have a large cohort of young people who have not had the opportunities to socialize and network build that people have had in the past. And we're trying to fill that gap. The second large barrier that queer youth find is finding an inclusive business to work for.
Mhm.
So part of the program is, and I hope businesses are out there are listening to this because I am training them to figure you out. Um,
Give
we
them
are
the intel.
teaching we are teaching them questions they can ask, specific pointed questions they can ask in interviews to find out if an employer is actually inclusive or if they just put a pride sticker in the window once a year. That's been honestly an extremely rewarding part of the programming. It's questions you can ask, a little bit of reading body language and researching the company and seeing what their actual credentials in inclusion are before you even apply.
Yeah. I personally love that so much because no one talks about it, like, at all. One of my favorite things to say to people, because I've done quite a few interviews myself, but then also, like, supporting other people through, like, the interview process is interviews are not just for the interviewer to learn about you. It is also for the interviewee to interview the interviewer. This is going to be a tongue
Mhm.
twister, to learn more about not only the role, but also who that individual is. Are you going to be reporting to them directly? If so, what is their teaching style? What is their learning
Yeah.
style? And then also, it's exactly as you said, like, is this company a safe space for me? Is this company going to respect me? Is this company going to create more barriers in the job? And as I said, like, no one really talks about that. They're just like, if you're queer, get a job, take whatever first job you can get, and then run with that. But,
Yeah.
in modern day, and this kind of goes back to the idea of pride and queer inclusion, it's 365 days a year, 24/7. So if you're, saying you're inclusive and you might have a diversity and inclusion policy, how often do you actually use that policy and implement it into your everyday practice,
Mhm.
including hiring practices, and not just have it as like a footnote on your website?
Very much.
Yeah. If anyone is looking to support the Thrive program, either as a participant, as a volunteer, or simply help support the program as it is growing, you can learn more about it at www.simplygoodform.ca/thrive. So to kind of end this episode, as we've been focusing on a lot of pretty heavy topics, especially for listeners who are members of the community, in particular the trans and non-binary community, is that to understand that there is community out there, regardless if you're in rural or not. Emma and I think are pretty good representations that things do get better if you're in a rural area. But regardless of where you are, where you're at in your journey, where you are at in your evolution and not phase of your life, is that there are people out there who hear you and they see you, and you may not hear or see them, but they still acknowledge that you exist and that you're valid in whatever stage of your journey that you're on. And that one experience doesn't represent the experiences of all. And, as Sin and I have said many times on the podcast, is that I speak to only my own experiences, and I always encourage others to share their own. As we're reflecting on TDoV, is to really recognize who in your community is visible, applaud them, celebrate them, but also look and see who isn't visible and who isn't able to be visible, and recognizing what we can do better to support those people in making them visible, or safely visible.
And I just want to add that it is incredibly easy to get overwhelmed by the amount of scary news that is coming in. But try to keep in mind that if you are out there and you are feeling afraid, you do have a community at your back. Reach out and find them.
That's all the time we have today, folks. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Hey Sis.
The conversation doesn't have to stop here, though. If you would like to get in touch with us to ask us a question or share your story on a future episode, you can email us at connect@simplygoodform.com or visit us on our website at www.heysis.com.